Elias Thorne was a man built of quiet strengths, content with the simple, profound joy found in the life he shared with his wife, Sarah, and the modest future they were building together. He wasn't ambitious in the way his brother-in-law, Arthur Finch, was. Arthur was a whirlwind of charm, ambition, and relentless drive, a man who filled rooms with his presence and conversations with promises of grandeur. He had married Sarah's older sister, Eleanor, a woman as vibrant and outgoing as Elias was reserved. Despite their differences, Elias had considered Arthur his closest friend, a confidant, almost a brother, bound by family and shared laughter over the years. They had even embarked on a joint venture, a modest investment opportunity that Elias had poured his life savings into, trusting Arthur's Midas touch in the market. Arthur had assured him it was a sure thing, a path to securing their future, a way to finally buy that little cottage by the coast Sarah dreamed of. Elias, ever the cautious one, had only gone forward because Arthur, family, friend, had vouched for it with fervent sincerity. The unraveling began subtly, a missed payment here, a delayed report there. Arthur was apologetic, attributing it to market volatility, unforeseen complications. Elias tried not to worry, trusting Arthur. But the delays grew, the excuses thinner. Financial pressures mounted. Sarah, never robust, fell ill. Not critically at first, but requiring care, medication. The dwindling funds, the stress of the investment turning sour, the constant worry about Sarah. It became a suffocating blanket. Elias had to take on extra work, stretching himself thin, his nights filled with anxiety instead of restful sleep beside his wife. He pleaded with Arthur, who was still living a life of apparent luxury, hosting lavish parties, expanding his own businesses. Arthur offered sympathy, empty promises, and small, inadequate loans that barely covered a week's worth of Sarah's needs, always reminding Elias how much he was helping him through this tough patch. Then came the day the world went black. Sarah collapsed. They rushed her to the hospital, but it was too late. The doctors spoke of complications of a weakened system of stress. Elias knew, with a sickening certainty that went deeper than grief, that the relentless financial strain, the worry etched onto Sarah's face in her final months, had stolen her from him. He buried his wife, his heart a hollowed-out cavern echoing with unspoken words and shattered dreams. Arthur was there, offering condolences, a comforting arm, tears in his eyes. Elias, numb with sorrow, clung to him, believing Arthur shared his pain, his loss. Arthur handled many of the arrangements, settled some of Elias's most pressing debts, the small ones, the ones that wouldn't draw attention, painting himself as a savior in Elias's darkest hour. Elias, broken and adrift, sold what little he had left, gave up the failing investment, taking a massive loss Arthur facilitated with practiced ease, and retreated into himself, accepting Arthur's offer of temporary lodging in a small, unused annex of his sprawling estate. He spent months in that annex, a ghost in the periphery of Arthur's vibrant, busy life. Grief was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. He barely ate, barely spoke, watching the world through a haze of pain. He saw Arthur continue his ascent, his name appearing in business journals, lauded for his acumen. He overheard snippets of conversations, Arthur discussing lucrative deals, future plans, never mentioning the failed joint venture that had cost Elias everything. It was a casual remark Arthur made one evening, dismissing the investment with a laugh to a colleague, calling it a necessary casualty of a larger strategy that pierced through Elias's grief-induced fog. A cold knot formed in his stomach. Necessary casualty? Whose casualty? Driven by a gnawing suspicion that felt like sacrilege against the memory of his friend, Elias began to stir. He started small, sifting through old papers, bank statements, contracts related to the investment. It was slow, painstaking work for a man whose mind felt like shattered glass. But as the pieces began to fit, a horrifying picture emerged. The investment wasn't a failure. It had been a shell, a deliberate sinkhole into which Elias's funds were funneled. The market volatility was a lie. Arthur hadn't lost money. He had diverted it. He had used Elias's capital, secured by Elias's assets, to leverage his own separate, profitable ventures, ensuring that any risk was borne by Elias alone while the rewards flowed exclusively to Arthur. The delays weren't unforeseen. They were manufactured, designed to bleed Elias dry, forcing him to sell low, allowing Arthur or his associates to acquire Elias's stake for pennies on the dollar, consolidating the profit Arthur had siphoned off. The realization hit Elias like a physical blow. Arthur hadn't just made a bad business decision. He had orchestrated Elias's ruin. He had seen Elias's modest wealth, his simple trust, and exploited it, systematically dismantling his financial stability. And knowing the stress this had placed on Sarah, knowing it had contributed to her death, Arthur had still stood over her grave, weeping crocodile tears, playing the part of the supportive friend while his pockets lined with the very money that could have eased Sarah's suffering. The grief for Sarah didn't lessen, but it transmuted into something else, something cold and sharp and utterly unforgiving. The quiet man felt a terrible furnace ignite within him. Justice, simple retribution, felt too small. Arthur hadn't just stolen Elias's money. He had stolen his wife, his future, his very identity. Elias wouldn't just take things back. He would dismantle Arthur piece by piece, just as Arthur had dismantled him. Elias left Arthur's annex without a word, leaving behind only a short, nondescript note. He vanished. For years, he was nothing. He worked menial jobs under different names, moving from town to town. But every spare moment, every spare cent, was dedicated to one purpose: learning. He devoured books on finance, law, digital security, human psychology. He learned how information flowed, how systems could be exploited, how reputations were built and destroyed. He wasn't seeking solace or a new life. He was forging himself into a weapon. He studied Arthur Finch from a distance, tracking his rising star, noting his habits, his weaknesses, his circle of associates, the intricate web of his business empire. He learned Arthur's vulnerabilities, his insatiable ego, his paranoia hidden beneath a veneer of confidence, his dependence on a carefully curated public image, his secret, illicit habits. Elias wasn't the simple man Arthur had betrayed. He was a ghost watching, learning, waiting. His plan wasn't a quick, explosive act of vengeance. It was a slow, complex mechanism, designed to tighten around Arthur's life imperceptibly at first, then with increasing, undeniable force. The revenge wouldn't be delivered by Elias's hand directly, not in any way Arthur could trace back easily. It would be delivered by Arthur himself, triggered by his own nature, his own past actions, guided by Elias's unseen hand. The first phase was subtle, almost invisible. Elias, using his newly acquired skills and years of patient observation, began planting seeds of doubt. Not about Arthur's integrity initially, but about his judgment. A carefully leaked piece of information to a minor competitor about a slightly shaky investment Arthur was considering. An anonymous tip to a low-level journalist about a rumor of financial instability in one of Arthur's less visible subsidiaries. Small things, deniable things, designed to cause Arthur minor annoyances, perhaps a slight dip in a stock price, a cancelled meeting, nothing significant enough to alarm him, but enough to subtly shift perceptions among those who watched him. Elias operated from the digital shadows, leaving no trace, a phantom whispering uncertainties into the financial winds. The second phase targeted Arthur's network. Elias had observed how Arthur relied on a core group of associates, many of whom were bound by mutual backscratching and shared secrets. Elias didn't expose the secrets outright. Instead, he used the information he had gathered: petty rivalries, hidden resentments, financial vulnerabilities within the group, to subtly exacerbate tensions. An anonymous email hinting that Arthur was privately criticizing one associate to another. A mistakenly sent financial report landing in the wrong inbox, revealing a disparity in how profits were shared. These weren't direct attacks, but corrosive agents, breeding mistrust and suspicion within Arthur's inner circle, making his allies slightly less loyal, slightly more self-interested. Arthur, confident in his manipulation of others, didn't notice the subtle fracturing until it was too late, attributing minor betrayals or shifting loyalties to the inherent nature of business, not a deliberate campaign against him. As Arthur's world began to feel slightly less stable, His paranoia, always present beneath the surface, began to surface. This was phase 3, using Arthur's own mind against him. Elias started feeding the paranoia. A mysterious dead drop containing a seemingly innocuous document that, upon closer inspection, hinted at surveillance. A series of encrypted messages sent to Arthur's burner phone that contained fragmented information only he and a few others would know, suggesting a leak from within his most trusted ranks. Elias didn't need to frame anyone. He just needed to point Arthur's suspicion inwards. Arthur, desperate to control his environment, began alienating those closest to him, firing loyal staff based on flimsy evidence, accusing longtime partners of treachery. His public persona started to crack, his charm replaced by a strained intensity, a flickering anger. The media noticed. His investors grew wary. Phase 4 was the structured demolition. Elias began using the hard evidence he had meticulously gathered over the years, the undeniable proof of Arthur's original fraud against him, the complex web of offshore accounts, the illegal leveraging, the tax evasions are not to confront Arthur, but to trigger investigations. Anonymous packages of documents sent to different regulatory bodies and investigative journalists in different countries, each piece of evidence designed to initiate separate, converging inquiries. The complexity was key. No single leak pointed definitively to one source, or even necessarily to Arthur alone initially, but collectively, they painted a damning picture of systemic corruption within Arthur's empire. The investigations started quietly, routine audits, inquiries into specific transactions. Then they escalated. The first major blow came when authorities in a small European country froze assets in an offshore account Elias knew Arthur used for illicit purposes. Arthur dismissed it publicly as a minor administrative issue, but Elias saw the panic in his eyes during a televised interview. Next, a major publication released an investigative piece hinting at financial impropriety within one of Arthur's flagship companies, citing unnamed sources and leaked documents that were too specific to ignore. Then came the domino effect. As investigators dug deeper, following the trails Elias had so carefully laid, they uncovered more and more. Associates started cooperating with authorities, cutting deals to save themselves, confirming the patterns of behavior Elias had highlighted years ago. The network Arthur had relied on turned on him, each person looking out for their own survival. The final phase was the reckoning, designed not just to ruin Arthur but to make him understand who was doing it and why, in a way that offered no escape or denial. As Arthur's world crumbled, as he faced indictments, lawsuits, and public disgrace, Elias sent him a single, untraceable message. It wasn't a threat, but a simple statement, detailing the exact date, time, and circumstance of the necessary casualty conversation Arthur had had years ago, the one that had ignited Elias's purpose. It mentioned the name Sarah and the coastal cottage dream, and it finished with a phrase Arthur had used to dismiss Elias after Sarah's funeral, a seemingly kind platitude that now held chilling weight. Some losses, Arthur, are simply irrecoverable. Arthur knew. In the space of a few weeks, he lost everything. His company, his wealth, his reputation, his freedom as he was placed under house arrest pending trial. His wife, Eleanor, filed for divorce, unable to bear the shame and the exposure of Arthur's many deceptions revealed during the investigations. His friends vanished. He was alone, facing ruin, and he knew with absolute certainty that it was the quiet man, the man he had broken, the man he had believed utterly defeated, who had orchestrated his downfall. Elias, from a distance, watched the news reports of Arthur Finch's spectacular fall. There was no triumphant feeling, no ecstatic rush of victory, just a deep, quiet stillness. Justice wasn't sweet. It was cold and absolute. The man who had taken everything from him now had nothing. The scale was balanced not with money or power, but with ruin for ruin, loss for loss. He had become something necessary, a force of retribution, fueled by unbearable pain and executed with pitiless precision. He closed the laptop, the screen showing Arthur's drawn, panicked face being escorted by officers. Sarah was still gone. The cottage by the coast remained a dream unfulfilled. But the man who had caused her suffering, who had built his success on Elias's ashes, was finally receiving his reckoning. not in a sudden, merciful collapse, but in a slow, agonizing dismantling engineered by the quiet man he had so carelessly destroyed. Elias stood, turned his back on the screen, and walked away, a ghost no longer defined by his past, but by the justice he had wrought from the shadows.